effective machine for doing that now and in the foreseeable future is a tree. And they take, you know, especially in temperate regions, at least 60 years to actually remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than their planting and soil disruption and stuff created in the first place. So that's not really an answer either.
Yeah, hello.
Hello, David Quaid, my name. Going back to more local application, perhaps, I'm told that Roger Begbie, the Minister for Fisheries, wouldn't want to approve too many marine conservation zones to create a legal burden to protect them, which would be costly. But I'm also told that such zones in many areas, including this zone, could be policed by local fishermen, effectively a vigilante group. And they could use like camera phones with GPS, so they get recordings of these ships, and they could be linked with the people who receive those fish or won't receive the fish. So putting pressure on, you know, enforcing the law, you know, without having to, the local law, you might say, without having to create marine conservation zones. Can it be done by localism?
All right, I'll have a go at this.
Can I just add, just an afterthought as well, I want to go into localism. What about what happened in Gibraltar? They dropped locks. There's things like loose balls. You can clean up cars and lorries, like somebody said before, and surround the zone with those to stop trawling. Trawling is the real problem.
Beware of what you wish for. You know, if you go to Louisiana and Texas and Alabama, their oceans are junkyards of privately established artificial reefs, which is essentially an excuse to get rid of bulky waste cheaply. And you know, there's all sorts of problems with that. But Gibraltar have a good case when they're setting out these artificial reefs that are anti-trawling devices, because trawling is one of the biggest impactors of the seabed, as we've heard repeatedly this evening. Greenpeace did the same thing in Germany because they were frustrated at the lack of protection given to a really important special area of conservation, which was just open to bottom trawling, and they said, well look, you know, we're going to do this because if the government isn't going to protect it, then we are, and we're going to dump all these concrete blocks, and it caused a furor in Germany, but in the end there is more protection now for that reef than there was before. So you're right that localism has a role. Obviously, with establishing lots of marine conservation zones around the country, they cannot be policed by you know, people zipping around in police boats and telling the public to get off and don't do this and don't do that. It's got to be led by people wanting to protect those areas, and that means that localism has to be a big part of it. People have to buy into the protection, and if you don't get that buy-in, then you won't have effective protection over the long term, because people will always find a way around the rules or always find ways to break the law. So you've got to have that buy-in, and that means engaging with the people who are using the area in meaningful ways, and that takes a lot of time. Well, one thing that's worth noting is that Richard Benning's department, DEFRA, or DEFRA, as I prefer to call it, only counts the cost of marine protected areas. It's not counting the benefits arising from them. And, you know, these benefits can be very considerable and can greatly outweigh the cost. In fact, another thing the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution said was that if you were to create, if we were to set aside 30% of the seas around Britain as marine protected areas, you would need only a 2 to 3% rise in the catch to pay for that. And given that you'd like to see a 2 or 300% rise in the catch, well, you know, Robert is a sibling of one of your parents, and so Bob's your uncle. You know, it's sorted out, and yet they just won't see that. However clearly the case is laid out, they refuse to see it. And what we're looking at here is an ideological restraint. It's not about money. it's not that there isn't even a coherent or logical industrial interest here. It's a sort of macho fixation with extractive industries, and this idea, which they find deeply offensive, of having any part of the seabed, even a few square meters, which is not open for extraction and destruction. For them, that seems to be some sort of affront to their hysterical belief that that everywhere should be scraped and scoured and extracted, and every single penny should be taken from it, even if, in the wider sense, that makes no economic sense whatsoever.
Yes. Thank you. Chit-Chong Ra. As a consumer, how effective do you think Marine Stewardship Council is as a stance on sustainable fishing, and on a more local basis, because we like to be local, when I go down to Sandways in West Bay and see those little baby lemon sole 3 inches long, should I spurn them?
The Marine Stewardship Council. Well, the Marine Stewardship Council, for those who don't know, gives a logo of approval to any fishery that meets a number of sustainability criteria. One of those criteria is that the stock has to be well managed, so we need to have good information on how many fish there are, and there need to be management structures in place to ensure that the targets are delivered. The second criterion is that the stock has to be at a good level, so in other words, a healthy population size. And the third criterion is that the stock, or the fishery, needs to be undertaken in a way which doesn't damage the wider environment or other species. Now, the Marine Stewardship Council is generally pretty good on the first two of those criteria, but they are hopelessly inept on the third of those criteria, the environmental damage, because unfortunately they're still very much looking at things through a single species lens, and the madness of certifying a prawn trawl fishery as being not environmentally damaging simply exposes the inadequacies of their certification method. Likewise, certifying a deep-sea fish that is a very large and vulnerable predator about which we know little from the icy waters of the Antarctic. That, again, is an anomaly. But on the other hand, for quite a lot of the time, the Marine Stewardship Council is a reasonable guide to buying fish that have come from fairly healthy stocks, which are managed reasonably well. So it's better than nothing most of the time. And so I'm not going to say don't look out for the blue logo. Do look out for the blue logo, and you'll have a clearer conscience than if you were simply to choose fish at random from the supermarket shelves. Ideally, the supermarkets would do the due diligence before you ever get into the shop, and make sure that the only fish that they are stocking are the ones that are in good shape, coming from fisheries that are well managed and that do minimal damage to the environment. There are supermarkets moving in the right directions, but they're not there yet. Some of them are much further along in the process. I can name names: Marks and Spencer, for example, Waitrose, Sainsbury's. These are supermarkets that are moving quite rapidly and proactively in the right direction. Even Tesco's coming along as well in the right direction. But there are some intransigents out there, and Morrison's is among them, for example. So I don't think you've got very many Morrison's this far south, but there you go.
I have a couple more questions, yes.
You know, there's an exemption under European fisheries legislation that you're allowed to land undersized or immature sole because the French consumers demand that they fit onto the plate. True, but if you're catching juvenile fish, it's okay to do that as long as you've got a healthy stock that's producing lots and lots of juveniles. But it's a risky strategy because they haven't reproduced yet. So you need to make sure that there's a good spawning stock out there to support the extraction of some of those animals at those small sizes. And I'm afraid that I'm not familiar enough with the sole fishery down here to be able to pass judgment.
Can I just add one thing to this? Because I do have a wider concern about the Marine Stewardship Council, and like Callum, I'm broadly supportive of it, but which is about the baseline. And if you look in the historical context, the sort of thing that Callum documents, you look at what the fishery looked like 150 years ago, you'll see that none of our stocks are anything like sustainably managed. They're wildly unsustainably managed, because what they're doing is looking at the state of the stock against a baseline set in 1970 or 1980 or something, and say, oh, this National Ecosystem Assessment, which is generally very good in most areas, said most of our stocks are at full reproductive potential. And you think, what are they talking about? And you look, and what they're doing is saying they're back up, in some cases, the way they were in 1970. But in 1970, those stocks were in a state of extreme depletion. And so, what we're doing is looking at a really shattered ecosystem and saying we're doing really well because we're keeping it only 95% shattered as opposed to 99% shattered. And none of that, I think, is good enough. And I think that once we start to see the establishment of a large network of no-take zones, which eventually, despite the desperate wriggling of cretins like Richard Benyon, eventually is going to happen, then I think people will begin to get a handle on what a marine ecosystem could look like. And then I hope very much that some of those baselines will start shifting back so that we have a better idea of what we're counting against.
Okay, yes, just getting towards the end now, just a couple more questions.
Hello, Simon Fairley, Land Magazine. I did actually work as a commercial fisherman for a short period of my life. I have to say it was one of the most challenging, interesting, stimulating job, in fact the most I've ever done in my life. Absolutely brilliant job. I want to look at, ask the panel to examine a certain ambivalence that I see in their approach to what they call the fishing industry, insofar as people, one moment they're talking about the fishing industry, and the next moment there seems to be a little bit of a sort of rift down the middle of the fishing industry. And I have here a very useful table done by David Thompson for the United Nations FAO, which compares the world's two marine fishing industries, how they compare large scale and small scale, i.e. industrial and small scale peasant, whatever you wish to call it. And the differences are astonishing. The number of fishermen employed is 500,000 in the industrial industry, 12 million in the small scale industry. The amount of fuel consumed, about 20 times as much per fish in the industrial industry as in the peasant industry. The amount of fish thrown away for bycatch, virtually none in the small scale industry, huge amounts in the industrial industry, and so on. Now,
can we come to the...
Yeah, I'm coming to the point, but I have to phrase this question as best I can. I would like, at the moment, the accent has been, all the concentration has been on marine reserves, and I'm fully in support of marine reserves. It seems to me there's other solutions as well to the fishing problem, and one of them is reducing fishing effort and reducing technology, and so that the big fishermen who are doing the bulk of the damage are limited, if not completely abolished, and the fishing industry goes back to small-scale fishermen who look after their own local areas. And I would like to hear what the panel think of that model of change in the fishing industry, as well as the marine conservation model.
I agree that there are big differences within the fishing industry, and there is no the fishing industry. There's a whole bunch of different fishery sectors pursuing their own individual catches and using their own individual methods. There is a broad distinction between small scale and large scale, and as George alluded to, the large scale have the loudest voice and the best funded lobbyists. And that's one of the reasons why the small-scale fleet in Britain, which is numerically by far the dominant one, gets something like 4 or 5% of the total allowable catch in terms of landings. Now, that is clearly skewed way out of the right balance, I think, in terms of where we want to be investing. And the small-scale fisheries are having less impact. But that's not to say they have no impact. And I had a master's student working over the last year on looking at the change in the fortunes of the inshore fisheries, using long lines in particular, since 200 years ago. And in the early 19th century, they were catching very large fish in abundance within 1 to 2 nautical miles of the coast. If you look at beach scenes in old engravings, there are huge ling, there are great common skate, there are large hake. All of these big fish were being caught very locally, and now they're not. We don't see those sorts of catches any longer because that the stocks are not there any longer. Since we started collecting statistics in the early 20th century, the proportion of elasmobranchs, the sharks and rays, has gone right down in those landings. So it's not true to say they have no impact, but that doesn't mean to say that the present catches and methods are not sustainable. They're just perhaps sustainable on a very much reduced number of species. I would like to see more localism, and I would like to see a fairer share for small-scale fishermen from reform of the common fisheries policy. It would be a good thing for the UK industry and a good thing for conservation. So I think your point is well made.
We've got time for one more question.
Good evening. I've got one comment and one question. The comment is that to your dream in combating climate change, George, I wanted to add mangroves and kelp and seagrass, since we're talking about marine reserves. My question, sorry, I had to write it down. Besides the marine reserves, the Marine Framework Directive introduces an ecosystem services approach to marine planning. What are your ethical and scientific and environmental views on the valuing of the environment on a cost-benefit analysis basis?
Well, thanks very much. It's a very interesting issue, this, and a very important one, because at the moment we have an ecosystem services task force, we have a natural capital committee, and they're talking about basically treating components of the ecosystem as commodities. They are commodifying them. And it's already got to quite extreme levels. I mean, the Natural Capital Committee talks about securitization of ecological derivatives, because all that stuff worked out so well before, didn't it? And they're talking about breaking down ecosystem services so that we can trade them individually. You know, if there's one thing we know about ecosystems, is that they function as coherent wholes, and that when you start breaking them down and disaggregating their functions, which is exactly what they're talking about, then that's when disaster strikes. So, you know, I'm not against the idea of recognizing the value of what's called natural capital and what the rest of us call the natural world, you know, and recognizing that it makes no sense whatsoever to destroy mangrove swamp, for instance, to build a shrimp farm, you know, which you know, is fairly common sense, but it's good to have it in figures. But I think that it's also a very dangerous process indeed, because what if, for instance, you find that a particular destructive activity is in fact more lucrative than preserving the resource? Well, if we, as people who are concerned about the environment, cede the ground to the money men and say, yes, we accept this cost-benefit analysis as a valid means of determining whether or not something should be saved, the moment it goes against us, then we've got no arguments left, because we've accepted the premise. But if we say, actually, it's not the money, we're not in this for the money, and this is my perspective, that I did not become an environmentalist because I'm concerned about how much the ecosystem might be worth to someone. I got into this because I love nature, and I've loved nature since I was a very small child. And one of the dangers that all of us who become environmentalists face is that we're sort of dragged further and further away from that, and we forget why it was that we became involved. And when it comes to the sea, I just love the stuff that lives in the sea. And I can completely accept that there are times when an economic argument is a valid one and a useful one, but it must not be the only one, and it must not drown out what I think is a far more important argument, that we should save it because it's magnificent, we should save it because it's wonderful, we should save it because we love it. And that, I think, is what we need to keep in mind.
Thank you very much indeed.